I think that's a challenge for photography, to take the strange and the exceptional and to, in some way, not diffuse it of its mystery, but to see it with clarity, not to sensationalize it. It's already sensational. But also, at the same time, to approach what is banal and ordinary or common, and to bring the same clarity and levity to it, which sets it free in some way and enables it to achieve its own enigma, its own glory. There's a restraint, that my way of stepping back and seeing things as they are without romanticizing or idealizing them. It was being in LA in '74 that I began to realize that I wasn't really a documentary photographer. That by virtue of how I put the pictures together, that I was instigating the suggestion of a narrative, that I was creating juxtapositions and relationships that were living strictly within the picture itself. That it wasn't about doing some kind of documentary report, some non-fictional representation of what was going on in front of me, but how to see the world and to see it in a way that I could shape it to my pictorial strategy. It really wasn't until 15 or 20 years down the road that I had both the intellectual clarity and the ability to detach myself, to step outside of where it was and to see what I was doing in a way with that greater perspective. So in fact, even with my pictures Recreation, I never published that work until 25 years later. They weren't coined Recreation when I was making them. Although I knew what I was doing, the pictures were about people in some ways, my people, American people, being out in the landscape, in repose, taking pleasure, doing different things for fun and leisure. But at the same time, I was also taking pleasure in the act of photographing within these landscapes, within these situations where I could create a certain kind of tableau, but I wasn't thinking in these large terms about bringing a certain specific kind of reading or agenda to the image making. It never was part of my plan to make my family subject for my art. In the fall of 1999, I got a call from my mom to tell me that two teenage boys had set a building that my dad owned that had been condemned on fire, and that it took an entire city block down with it, and that my dad was in trouble. He was facing a lawsuit from a neighboring Catholic church for $15 million. At the same time, a furniture store that had been started by his father was on the verge of going bankrupt. I could see that my effort, my presence there was meaningful to my father. There was something profound that was unraveling here that I had some kind of access to. And I think it was the first time that I didn't feel like I had to repudiate where it was I came from. The fact that I was of this sort of small New England town and that I had to leave it and to bury it, to find my roots here in New York and to go as far away as India, to marry an Indian, to basically just put that all out of the picture. To go home and to see that this was a world that I knew really deeply, and that what was happening was emotionally challenging and moving, but there was a story here that I felt like I had no choice but to respond to. It wasn't like I set out with really big ideas in my head that this experience here in Holyoke, Massachusetts was symbolic of other towns, and this larger decline, this failure, this David and Goliath story of the small businessman, the family businessman who worked and lived with integrity, was a World War II veteran, that they didn't stand a chance against corporate America. And it became clear, though, that there was this larger shift going on. I realized that this story was really more universal. And that's what I think, in a way, gave it its breadth, that it could speak. Everybody has a father. Everybody's got a certain amount of alienation and anxiety about their relationship with their father. My challenge was to make a piece of work that could navigate through those challenges, and to do it with a kind of sensitivity, but without the fear of being truthful. With American Power, a magazine editor, Kathy Ryan, took note of the fact that I had done a project about the death of a town. She's the Times picture editor, asked me whether I would do a commissioned essay about the death of another town, Cheshire, Ohio, which small hamlet on the Ohio River, which sat in the shadow of one of our largest coal-fired power plants. The town had been sold to the utility company American Electric Power, in part to stave off environmental contamination lawsuits from people in the town who were getting sick. It was like a, Aaron Brockovich story. Houses were being bulldozed and razed to the ground. There were maybe 10 renegades, including an 80-year-old woman that was sort of a little bit like my father in terms of her place in life, who was devoted to this place. She wasn't going to leave it. The ship was going down, but she wanted to stay. She made sense. And so I then decided to take this project to the next stage, where I would look at these relationships around the theme of energy, looking at the intersection of community, corporation. I was stopping on the side of the road or on the sidewalk, and I'd have state police coming by saying, "You can't make pictures." So where did the government fit in? This was a remarkable opportunity to go back out and look at the American landscape and see it through the theme of our dependency on energy and some of the manifestations of that dependency in a kind of bigger way. And I designed trips where I would photograph in regions that were rich in energy production. Over 5 years, I traveled to 25 states. I went as far west as Hawaii and as far north as Alaska, leading west and thinking about manifest destiny and the history of photography in the United States and the early industrialization of the West. I had a trip planned to go to the Gulf Coast, and Katrina came, and I had never before set out to make pictures in the aftermath of disaster. I was very reticent about it. It began to crack open my own way of reading what the definition of the project was, and to give it license to look in a kind of larger sense at what maybe some of the consequences were of our dependency and our relationship to the subject of energy. This kind of powerful hurricane is happening because of global warming, climate change. And I've long been interested in trees, but it was very specific to New York. It was about how to return to my home place and to see it anew, and to make a kind of portrait of the city through photographing a selection of its trees. But it became about a lot of things the deeper that I got into it, as my projects go. I partly worked in black and white because I wanted the pictures to be contemporary. I wasn't doctoring them, but I wanted to be able to photograph the trees and contextualize them within the urban landscape of the city. And as I went along, I realized I was making portraits of trees. And even as I conceived them as works for the wall, I decided to make them at a height that would be human-like, so that you'd face off to those trees and relate to them in a way that was as if you were facing another person in terms of simply their scale. Here was this tree that was 350 years old, just around the corner from me in Washington Square, that was planted when this landscape was Dutch farmlands, and the city sort of built itself up around it. So instead of looking at the tree with the city, as some punctuation within this larger architectural and human landscape of the city, it was meaningful for me to bring that tree forward that came before everything that built itself up around it, and to do it in a way that would create this kind of layered experience where, yes, the tree was center stage, and it was witness to this long time. I think that the trees led me to think about time. They outlive us, many of them, but they outlive us in the bigger sphere. They're within a human time span. I read an essay that Robert Smithson wrote about Olmsted, called The Dialectical Landscape, and it got me to go back and look at Central Park and to see it really for the fiction that it is. With farmlands there, Olmsted had this, grand opportunity to make a park, really within the heart, the sort of organ of the city. His conceit was to think about what actually was the history of this place, the geological history. So what that meant specifically was that the rock formations, and even erratic rocks, are there with the illusion that this all was just nature discovered, wilderness. But the rocks are the rocks, and his way of bringing them, outcroppings to the fore or placing erratic rocks, was about creating an experience of wonder and awe and levity within this, the ambitions of this city that was beginning to become industrialized and significant as a real hub. So that was a kind of starting point for me to go on another path, thinking about the city and looking at its relationship to time, to long time. And then it led me to make pictures about clouds, because I realized that rocks and clouds were this sort of perfect, kind of classical yin-yang set of opposites. Clouds, they're everywhere, they're constantly changing, just like the city itself. So I saw this kind of apt parallel, this kind of metaphor, and that the two, in a way, would give me the ability to play off these two very different concepts of time. The ephemeral and the near infinite, the immutable. I think the key word, and I think this relates to the pictures themselves, and it's where I've been going, for a period of time since I've been working with an 8x10, is to arrive at a distillation, to make my pictures layered, for them to have depth. In each picture, in some way, to hold its own, needs to have its conceptual depth, spatial depth, to have this kind of layering that's going to be able to provide a reward, and that's going to deepen through longer looking. But to make a single picture that's going to hold its own, that's going to have some of the breadth of what you could do with multiple pictures, is harder. And that's one of the challenges that I'm engaged with.